The message echoes across America. Defund the police. For some, that means abolishing law enforcement completely. For others, it means increasing oversight. Even playgrounds in the U.S. have federal guidelines. But America's 18,000 independent police departments set their own course. Jack Glazer studies racial bias in policing and is developing a national database of police stops and use of force incidents.
There are no set guidelines for how you construct a police force or what a police department can do.
San Francisco Police Chief William Scott is a 30-year veteran who says he supports reform.
Last Thursday, San Francisco Mayor London Breed and Chief Scott announced a series of sweeping reforms. They include reducing the use of military tactics and equipment, redirecting funding to community programs, and referring certain 911 calls to outside specialists like mental health professionals.
We need a push right now, and we need what's happening right now to happen. We need the public to stand behind it and demand it.
Across the country, lawmakers are moving quickly. Minneapolis's city council says it will dismantle and reinvent its department. New York State just announced it will end a policy that has kept officers' disciplinary records secret. But public policy experts say we need change at a national level. Police should have to report their work to a central database. Right now, reporting is voluntary, and independent databases have found that official police data has underreported shootings by half. Another proposal, limits on police unions. The contracts that they negotiate can allow officers to withhold video footage or to confer with each other after a shooting before speaking with investigators. Training for problems like bias must improve, as well as hiring mental health specialists or outsourcing those calls. At least 1 in 4 fatal police shootings involves someone with a serious mental illness. Glazer says that only an act of Congress can get us the reform we'll need.
In terms of a national understanding and a national accountability, that's going to have to be mandatory, and it's going to have to be at the federal level.
America has spoken, the world has spoken, that there needs to be some changes in policing, and we have to be open to that.
And Jake Ward joins me now from San Francisco. Jake, let's localize this. Talk more about what's been happening in San Francisco and what kinds of reforms, changes are they hoping for there?
Well, here's the thing to understand, Allison. It is a totally federated system in the United States when it comes to policing. There are 18,000 police departments, 300 police agencies in California alone, and each of them sets their own rules. So even though SFPD behind me is setting out these very progressive reforms, not 20 or 30 miles from here, we've had 2 different shootings by other law enforcement agencies since June 2nd. One man, Eric Salgado, killed in what police say was a stolen car. Another one, Sean Monterosa, shot during the protests when he was, the police say, perhaps looting a pharmacy, but came out, had a hammer in his pocket, you'll recall, and it was mistaken for a weapon. He was shot through the windshield of a Vallejo police cruiser. I mean, these things are going on here. In fact, when we were in the midst of covering the protests, I had this incredible conversation with a man named Rick Perez, whose son, Petey Perez, was killed by Richmond police. Again, just a neighboring jurisdiction here back in 2014. Listen to how he described the pain that he's feeling.
My son was unarmed, and this cause is very heavy in my heart, you know.
And so 2014 was, I mean,
almost 6 years ago, and you think the police would have learned by now, and they keep on doing it. I'm not sure if you noticed, but I have names of a lot of people on the side of my truck, all from California, and I need a bigger truck, and they keep doing it.
He says there he needs a bigger truck, Allison, because he's running out of space for all the names of young people killed by police here in California. I mean, this is going on and on. Of course, as of yesterday, Sunday, the 3 biggest police unions here in California, Los Angeles, San Jose, and San Francisco, have come out and said that they are in favor of a national reform program and are taking the proactive step of proposing some things, including a database, a requirement to report misconduct so that the same officers can't be hired again. All of these sorts of reforms suddenly coming to light from quarters like police unions where you would never have heard of them before, Alice.
Yeah, Jake, I think so many of us have been confused about where change is coming from and on what levels it might be enacted. Thank you for talking us through that, because I think you really put it in context of how many different police departments can even be working in such a small area, and they're all run so differently.
Exactly. The rules change from precinct to precinct, Allison. It's just a totally individuated kind of free market of policing we live in America right now. Maybe that'll change.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.